Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where your dinner could be your last meal. Literally. You're stepping into the rough and tumble dining scene of medieval times, where the food is, well, let's just say brutal. Imagine sitting down at a wobbly wooden table, the smell hits you before the food even arrives, and you start wondering if you'll survive this meal at all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what city you're in and what time it is right now. I love knowing who's tuning in from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step through the low timber-framed doorway, ducking instinctively as the rough oak beam brushes the top of your head. The air inside is thicker than you expect, heavy with the layered scent of smoke, sweat, damp wool, and something that might be roasting meat, or might just be the memory of it from days ago. The warmth hits you like a blanket fresh from the fire, except this blanket is made of smells and tiny flecks of ash that swirl lazily in the dim light. The floor beneath your boots squelches in places, a mixture of trampled rushes, spilled ale, and whatever the last rainstorm dragged in from the street. You shift your weight, and the sound is soft and wet, like stepping on a loaf of bread that's been left out in the rain. A few dried sprigs of rosemary have been thrown among the rushes, not for decoration, but to keep the smell from becoming unbearable. You can almost hear the rosemary sigh, "We're doing our best here." Your eyes adjust to the dimness and you take in the scene. The hall is long and narrow, with a row of trestle tables running down the center, each flanked by benches worn smooth by years of use. At the far end, a fireplace as wide as a small bedroom breathes its smoky warmth into the room. The fire doesn't so much roar as mumble, logs shifting and hissing now and then, sending brief sparks into the hooded chimney. You take a seat on one of the benches, and it responds with a wobble that makes you reconsider your choice. The table is a thick slab of oak, its surface scarred by generations of knives, spills, and elbows. In the middle runs a deep crack, a fault line in the wood, as though the table itself once endured a terrible winter and never quite recovered. Someone has tried to seal it with a mixture of wax and cloth strips, but they've long since worked loose. You can see a crumb or two lodged in there, possibly older than you are. In front of you sits your plate, not a plate at all but a trencher, a disc of bread so hard it could double as a shield in a tavern brawl. This bread has been baked at least a week ago, intentionally tough so it won't disintegrate under the flood of meat juices and stew about to come. The plan is simple. The food will sit on top of it, soaking in, and later you can eat the softened part, or toss it to the dogs if it's too far gone. In this world, nothing is truly wasted, but nothing is truly fresh either. A boy no older than 12 comes by with a pitcher and sloshes a cloudy amber liquid into your wooden cup. You lean forward to sniff it, but the smell reaches you first. Warm, yeasty, faintly sour. It's ale, the everyday drink of peasants and lords alike. Weak in alcohol but safer than the water here, which is, let's say, unpredictable. The village stream has been shared with animals for centuries, and the well occasionally turns up water that looks clear but hides tiny, invisible invitations to disaster. You take a sip. It's not bad. The flavor is grainy, with a sweetness that quickly gives way to a slight bitterness from the yeast. It's room temperature, or rather room and fireplace temperature, and strangely comforting. Your tongue registers no fruit, no hops, no crispness, just the honest taste of barley doing its job. You remind yourself that for the people here, this is hydration, calories, and a touch of pleasure all at once. The first course arrives in a large wooden bowl, pottage. At first glance, it looks like oatmeal that has taken a long, meandering walk through a vegetable garden. Barley, peas, carrots, leeks, all boiled into a thick, uniform softness. It's seasoned with a pinch of salt and maybe some herbs, though after hours over the fire, any bright flavors have surrendered to the mush. You scoop some onto your trencher and watch it sit there obediently, refusing to drip. This is the medieval staple, the dish that keeps peasants alive through the year. Endlessly adaptable, endlessly reheated, endlessly thickened until it's hard to tell where yesterday's dinner ends and today's begins. In fact, the very concept of leftovers is foreign here. Food is a continuous project. simmering in the pot day after day, ingredients added as they come. Historians still debate whether this endless boiling made the food safer or simply concentrated whatever bacteria had already moved in. You take a bite. It's bland but not unpleasant. The vegetables have given all they had to give, and the barley provides a chewiness that keeps the spoon from feeling lonely. Still, your modern palate itches for something, acid, spice, anything. You glance at the merchant across the table, who is sprinkling something from a small pouch onto his stew. The smell hits you immediately: pepper. Pepper in the medieval world is not just seasoning. It's a symbol, a statement. Each tiny black bead has traveled across oceans, deserts, and political intrigue to get here. You imagine the caravans crossing hot sand under a punishing sun, the merchants bargaining in bustling ports, the pirates lurking in shadowed coves. This pinch of pepper may have changed hands more than a dozen times, each trader adding their markup until it's worth its weight in silver. The merchant notices your interest and grins, offering you a pinch. You accept, sprinkle it over your pottage, and take another bite. The difference is shocking, not fiery but aromatic, the warmth blooming slowly across your tongue. You understand immediately why pepper was such a luxury, and why medieval cooks, when they could afford it, used it with a heavy hand. Some modern historians argue that pepper was meant to cover the taste of slightly aged meat, while others dismiss this as a myth. You, however, are not entirely convinced after what arrives next. The second course is meat, a generous term. It's pork, smoked and salted until it's the texture of a woolen glove left out in winter. You saw off a piece with the communal knife, pop it into your mouth, and begin the slow process of convincing it to yield to your teeth. The salt hits first, drawing every drop of moisture from your tongue, then the smoky tang emerges, mingling with the pepper you still taste from before. You ask the woman beside you, sturdy build, sleeves rolled up, flowers still clinging to her arms, how long the meat has been hanging. "A month," she says cheerfully, as if that's barely worth mentioning. She laughs at your raised eyebrows, revealing teeth worn flat from years of grinding against coarse bread studded with bits of millstone grit. Archaeologists often find medieval skeletons with teeth worn down to the roots, and now you know why. Further down the table, a different smell drifts toward you: fish. At least you think it's fish. The aroma is sharp, tangy, almost confrontational. This is stockfish, dried, rehydrated, and cooked with whatever spices are available. Some say the trick is to soak it long enough to soften, but not so long that it begins to dissolve into something gelatinous. The debate over how much is too much is ongoing, and has been for centuries. You return to your pottage for a few safe spoonfuls, but then the final surprise of the evening arrives: a pie. The crust is thick, more of a container than a delicacy, designed to hold in the filling during baking. Inside you find a mix of minced meat, dried fruit, and, unexpectedly, eggs. The sweetness of the fruit collides with the savoriness of the meat in a way that makes you pause. You look around to see if anyone else is reacting, but the locals are tucking in happily. Medieval cooking loved this blend of sweet and savory, a combination modern Western tastes have largely abandoned. As you chew, you catch snippets of conversation, news from the next village, gossip about the Lord's steward, a heated argument about whether last year's harvest was the worst in memory or merely bad. The soundscape is as much a part of the meal as the food. The thud of spoons, the occasional bark of laughter, the creak of the benches, the crackle of the fire. By the time you finish, your trencher has softened under the steady assault of juices and steam. You break off a piece, bite into it, and feel the odd texture of bread that's both soggy and stale. It's edible, barely, but you understand why many people feed it to the dogs instead. Still, after hours of chewing salted meat and dense pottage, the trencher's warmth is oddly satisfying. You lean back, cup of ale in hand, and take in the scene one last time. The flickering light catching on the sheen of the pork, the steam rising from the pottage, the shared pepper pouch moving from hand to hand like a prized relic. You realize that survival here isn't just about having food, it's about having the kind of food that won't kill you too quickly. Every choice, from soaking the bread to boiling the pottage, is part of a quiet, ongoing battle against hunger, illness, and the seasons themselves. In this hall, the meal is over when the fire burns low and the ale runs dry. People rise, stretch, and drift back into the night, their footsteps fading into the muddy street. You stand, feeling the wooden bench's imprint on the back of your legs, and step toward the door. Outside, the cool air rushes to meet you, and you can still taste the pepper on your tongue, a reminder of just how far this evening's meal has traveled to reach you. You don't get far down the street before you're pulled into another hall. This one smaller but warmer, with the kind of heat that comes from a kitchen in full swing. You barely have time to adjust before the smells hit you. Not the earthy, barley-thick scent of pottage, nor the honest smokiness of salted pork. No, this is sharper, stranger, like someone took every scent from a spice market, locked them in a cupboard, and let them argue for a few days. Your nose twitches. You recognize something sweet, almost floral, drifting in from the right. Cinnamon, maybe? Or could it be cloves? Then there's the heavy, earthy undertone of black pepper. So much pepper that it overpowers the meat it's resting on. And somewhere behind all that, the faint ghost of something you can't quite name, a bitterness that makes you think of dried bark or medicine. A plump man in a wine-red tunic strides over, holding a platter piled high with what appears to be roasted fowl. Except you're not sure. The meat is slathered in a golden sauce that gleams like melted sunlight. It smells of ginger, saffron, and something sweet, probably honey. It's the kind of dish you could imagine at a royal banquet, but here it is in front of you, in a hall that smells faintly of damp wool and boiling turnips. Try it, the man urges, beaming with the pride of a magician revealing his latest trick. You take a cautious bite and the flavors assault you all at once. First the honey, sticky, rich, then the saffron's peculiar floral bitterness, then the ginger's gentle heat, and finally a wall of cinnamon that overwhelms everything else. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's also not what you'd expect from a piece of roasted meat. You chew and realize you can barely taste the bird beneath the spice curtain. This is not an accident. This is the point. Because in medieval Europe, spices are not just for flavor, they're for status. Each pinch of saffron is a whisper of far-off lands. Every clove has traveled oceans. Nutmeg? That tiny brown seed once made merchants rich and entire islands fight for control. To sprinkle these liberally over your dinner is to shout to the world, I can afford to make my food taste like anything I want. You glance around and see it everywhere. A fish pie dusted with enough mace to make your tongue numb. Stewed venison laced with a chaotic mix of ginger, pepper, and sugar, the last one imported at a price that would make a peasant weep. A pot of wine simmering with cinnamon sticks as thick as your thumb. Historians still argue about this. Were medieval people obsessed with spices because they genuinely loved the taste? Or because they wanted to show off? Some say the sheer cost of these ingredients made them irresistible symbols of power. The more you used, the wealthier you must be. Others believe that after months of eating preserved meat and old grain, your palate would crave anything intense and different. And then there's the more cynical theory, the one whispered over tankards of ale in the back of kitchens. That spices, especially in lavish amounts, were sometimes used to disguise things. Like meat that had been salted 1 month too many. Or fish that had traveled a little too far without quite enough ice. You're about to dismiss the idea as a modern exaggeration when a servant passes by with a platter of something that smells tired. The meat glistens in a way fresh meat doesn't, and the scent beneath the saffron and pepper is faint but unmistakable, a hint of rot hiding under the perfume. The servant sets it down in front of a group of guests who dig in without hesitation, perhaps because they truly can't taste the problem through the spice barricade. Or perhaps because they'd rather not admit they notice. Your mind wanders to the economics of all this. In the 14th century, a pound of black pepper could cost as much as a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. Saffron? Even more. And yet here you are, in a middle-sized town's banquet, watching it rain pepper like it's barley. You imagine the journey of a single clove. Born on a tree in the Maluku Islands, picked by hand, dried in the sun until its skin wrinkles like an old sailor's. Packed onto a ship, traded for silver, carried across seas and deserts, handed from merchant to merchant until it reaches the spice stalls of Venice or Bruges. From there, it's weighed, sold, and finally ends up here, crushed between a cook's fingers, tumbling into a pot of boiling wine. By the time you taste it, The clove has crossed more miles than most people in this room will in their lifetime. You take another bite of the saffron chicken, and it occurs to you that medieval seasoning is less about subtlety and more about theater. The dish doesn't have layers of flavor that reveal themselves slowly, it has a single, thunderous impact. Like a trumpet blast instead of a string quartet. Some spices are unfamiliar to you entirely. The cook shows you a jar of grains of paradise, tiny reddish seeds that smell like a cross between pepper and citrus. Then there's long pepper, a spice that looks like a miniature pine cone and delivers a more intense burn than the black pepper you know. And galingale, a root related to ginger with a scent that's somehow both floral and earthy. You realize as you taste each in turn that medieval cooks weren't careless, they were adventurous. They mixed spices the way painters mix colors, sometimes ending up with masterpieces, sometimes with something you'd politely call bold. But there's also the matter of misfire. You're handed a small tart, delicate crust, beautiful golden filling. You take a bite, expecting something sweet, and instead get a wallop of black pepper and cumin. Your eyes water. Someone nearby laughs. "Ah, that's a good one," they say. Apparently, surprising guests with unexpected spice combinations is a form of entertainment. You sit back, letting the heat from the fire and the spices mingle in your chest. The hall hums with conversation, stories of trade caravans, gossip about who's been seen buying the most saffron lately, arguments over whether sugar is better used in meat dishes or desserts. Sugar, by the way, is its own kind of spice in this world. It's rare, expensive, and sold in solid cones that must be scraped with a special tool. You watch as a servant carefully shaves off curls of it into a pot of wine, each flake dissolving into the liquid like gold dust. You recall that in this period sugar is thought of as a medicine as much as a sweetener. Physicians prescribe it for coughs, stomach troubles, and even melancholy, though whether it actually helps is another debate that historians still have fun with. The evening stretches on, each dish more elaborate than the last. A swan, roasted and then redressed in its own feathers for presentation. A fish dyed bright green with parsley juice. A jelly molded into the shape of a castle, studded with candied almonds. And in all of them, spices, bold, unblended, unapologetic. You leave the hall much later, your tongue buzzing from pepper, your nose still tingling with saffron, and your stomach trying to decide whether it's happy or confused. The night air feels plain, unseasoned, almost comforting in its neutrality. Walking back toward the inn, you realize that spices in medieval Europe are like stories. They travel, they change in the telling, they carry with them the weight of every hand they've passed through. And whether they're used to delight, to boast, or to hide a little culinary mischief, they're never boring. You awaken the next morning with the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the thin cracks of the inn's window shutters. The morning light, weak and filtered, creeps in as if cautious to wake you fully. But your stomach, faithful as ever, reminds you that it's time to face the day, medieval style. Your mind drifts immediately to the most basic yet ubiquitous items on the table, bread and ale. In this world, bread is not just food. It is identity, survival, social rank, and, sometimes, danger. The bread you'll eat today won't be the soft, fluffy loaf you might imagine from a modern bakery. Instead, it's a dense, heavy slab baked in communal ovens, made from coarse, often impure grains. You may find it so hard that it could double as a weapon in a pinch, or a shield in a tavern scuffle. As you settle at the morning meal, the trencher, a thick round slice of bread, sits in front of you much like yesterday. It is the centerpiece, the foundation, and often the plate. It will soak up the stew or meat juices, absorbing flavors but also, sometimes, unwelcome guests. You take the trencher up to your nose and inhale. The scent is earthy, weedy, but with an undertone you can't quite place. There's a faint hint of sourness, not from intentional fermentation, but from the grain's slow decay. Bread wasn't baked daily for most. It was baked to last, often days or even weeks, especially for the poor. A stale crust meant fewer loaves to bake and less work on the communal oven. You bite in and your jaw works hard to break the crust. The texture is firm, almost brick-like. You recall learning from historians that medieval bakers didn't sift flour finely. Instead, bits of millstone grit mixed with bran often found their way into the dough, meaning you were literally chewing stone along with your bread. Over years, this natural abrasion wore down teeth, something medieval skeletons in archaeological digs show in grim detail. Beside you, a farmer's wife noisily gnaws on her trencher, the sound echoing in the sparse hall. She laughs at you struggling with yours and jokes, "A strong jaw is a strong woman's best tool." You grin despite yourself. Then comes the ale, your daily drink, your safest bet against the tainted waters outside. You reach for the wooden cup and bring it to your lips. The ale is murky, cloudy with suspended yeast and grain particles, far from the clear brews you might expect today. It's brewed fresh or rebrewed regularly to keep the alcohol content low enough to avoid intoxication but high enough to kill off most waterborne diseases. You take a careful sip. The taste is malty, sour, and with a slight bitterness. The bubbles are soft and fleeting. You learn that ale in the Middle Ages was a nutritional supplement, more of a meal than a drink. The yeast provided proteins and vitamins, and the low alcohol content was just a bonus. Your mind wanders to the risks you don't see. Water in villages often comes from wells or streams, many of which are easily contaminated by livestock or human waste. Drinking raw water could mean cholera, dysentery, or worse. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled and fermented, making it safer. Still, brewing wasn't always perfectly hygienic, and sometimes the very same yeast strains could cause unpleasant or dangerous side effects. You reach for another bite of bread and notice a small black speck embedded in the crust. It's a grain of burnt grain, likely from the bottom of the oven. These impurities were common and tolerated. Occasionally, fungal growth, known today as ergot, would infect the rye or wheat fields. Consuming ergot-contaminated bread caused ergotism, a terrifying illness that could lead to convulsions or hallucinations. Scholars argue about how often ergotism affected medieval populations, but records do show outbreaks severe enough to impact entire villages. You set the bread down, pondering. This staple, the simplest food, was actually a gamble with your health every time you ate it. And yet, for most, it was the only gamble worth taking. The conversation at the table shifts to the brewing process. A jovial brewer named Tomas explains that ale was brewed daily in homes and taverns alike. His pride is a strong ale with a rich body, something the wealthier folk might enjoy for breakfast or supper. But for most peasants, the ale was weak, more of a drink to keep up strength during long days of labor. Tomas laughs when he says, "Stronger ale knock you flat faster than a lance in battle." You watch as a group of children play near the hearth, occasionally sneaking sips from a communal wooden cup. Tomas grins and says, "It's safer than water, and a little keeps the nits away." The children giggle, unfazed by the idea that their favorite drink is also a primitive form of medicine. You look around and realize bread and ale were not just sustenance but cultural pillars. Peasants and lords alike built their days around them. Markets sold grains, ovens fired up at dawn, and breweries hummed with activity. Bread prices even influenced local economies. A bad harvest could mean rocketing bread costs, which might spark riots. In fact, you learn that breaking bread was more than just sharing food, it was a social contract, a bond. Families and neighbors who ate together trusted each other, and sharing your trencher was an invitation to camaraderie. Despite all this, you're aware that medieval hygiene left much to be desired. You recall reading how communal bread ovens were breeding grounds for disease if not properly maintained. Flies, rodents, and other pests were common in food storage areas, spreading bacteria and parasites. Drinking vessels weren't always washed and often shared without much thought. The ale too had its risks. While fermentation killed many pathogens, poorly brewed batches could harbor harmful bacteria or wild yeasts, leading to sickness. Still, for all its dangers, ale was a mainstay. People preferred its taste and perceived safety over questionable water. You finish your meal slowly, savoring the familiar flavors while your mind races with the contradictions. Bread, the foundation of medieval life, both food and hazard. Ale, a drink and a medicine, sometimes safer than water but never risk-free. Before leaving the table, you ask Tomas about the common practice of sourdough starters. He nods enthusiastically, explaining how households kept a bit of old dough alive to leaven new batches, a living culture passed down like a family heirloom. This starter, he says, could live for years if tended carefully, adding complexity to the bread's flavor and aiding digestion. You imagine the generations who've tasted the same sourdough, bonding through time by sharing this living ingredient. It's humbling to think that a simple piece of bread carries within it the history of thousands. As you rise from the bench, you feel the weight of centuries pressing down, bread and ale humble yet vital, the daily constants in a world where survival was never guaranteed. And now, armed with this knowledge, you understand that every meal you eat in this era is a silent act of courage. Outside, the streets are muddy and noisy, but your thoughts linger on the taste of coarse bread and cloudy ale. They aren't glamorous, but they are life. The first hint that something is off comes from the smell. It starts faint, almost like a memory of last night's fire mixed with damp straw. Then it sharpens, creeping into your nostrils like an uninvited guest. It's the scent of meat, but not the kind that makes you lick your lips and think of feasts. No, this is meat that has seen better days. And perhaps those better days were last season. You follow the smell into the back of a bustling market square. Stalls are draped in linen to shield their wares from the sun, or more likely to hide them from curious eyes. Behind one such cloth, a butcher works his cleaver into a hunk of something red-brown and streaked with fat. His movements are swift, almost defensive, as if he's in a race with time itself. The piece he's cutting from isn't glistening like fresh meat. It's darker, the edges drying into a leathery rind. You can see where the blade has passed before, revealing marbling that's both promising and suspicious. There's a salty tang in the air masking, but not quite erasing, a deeper sour note. This is medieval meat. And in a world without refrigeration, it is a precarious thing. The butcher looks up and grins. "Fine beef from a good animal," he says, as if reading your hesitation. "Salted well. Kept safe." He gestures toward a barrel nearby. You step closer, peering over the rim, and see cuts of meat submerged in a brine so thick it could pickle a horseshoe. Salt crystals cling to the surface like frost. You know enough to understand what you're looking at. Salt, one of the most precious commodities of the medieval world, as a lifeline against decay. It doesn't stop the clock, but it slows it, leaching moisture from the meat and making it less hospitable to the invisible armies of bacteria that would otherwise claim it. You take a step back as the smell intensifies. The salt masks some odors, but it can't mask time. Some of these cuts have likely been in that barrel for weeks, maybe months. When finally hauled out for cooking, they will need hours of soaking to rinse away the salt. And even then, they'll taste more like brine than beef. You pass on, weaving between stalls. Here's a table with what looks like ham, except the skin is hard as parchment. You give it a polite tap and it sounds almost hollow. Cured meat could last much longer than fresh, but even curing wasn't foolproof. If the salt content was too low, mold could creep in. Too high, and the meat might become so hard it was nearly inedible without boiling it half a day. And if you were poor, you didn't get the best cuts. You got trimmings, offal, or meat already halfway to spoilage. This is where creativity, and sometimes danger, entered the medieval kitchen. A cook waves you over to a steaming pot. Inside, hunks of meat float in a dark broth, their surfaces glistening with fat. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, are sprinkled in with a generous hand. You recall yesterday's realization about spices. They are as much about disguise as they are about flavor. Here the reason is obvious. The steam carries both the warmth of the cloves and a faint undertone of, well, something you'd rather not identify before eating. Historians still debate how often medieval people knowingly ate spoiled meat. Some say the idea is overblown, that even without refrigeration, careful salting, smoking, and drying could keep meat edible far longer than we might expect. Others argue that the prevalence of strong sauces and spices in recipes hints at a need to mask off flavors. You take a small bite. The meat is chewy, the fibers separating reluctantly, the salt soaking into every pore. There's no overt rot, just an aged, slightly sour tang that makes you sip ale between mouthfuls. If you were wealthy, things might be different. Nobles could afford fresh game, deer, boar, swan, even peacock, hunted and cooked within a day or two. In grand kitchens, meat was roasted on great spits over open fires, the fat basting it as it turned. Servants with ladles of wine or vinegar would moisten the roast, keeping it from drying. Still, even in castles, meat preservation was essential in winter, when hunting was poor and fresh supplies scarce. But for townsfolk and peasants, fresh meat was rare. Animals were often slaughtered in the late autumn, when cooler temperatures slowed spoilage, and the meat was preserved for winter. This meant much of what you ate was months old, pulled from storage and prepared with whatever tricks you could muster to make it palatable. You remember hearing about pottage, the endlessly simmering stew kept at the hearth, into which meat and vegetables were added as available. In such a stew, older meat could soften and take on the flavors of herbs, grains, and whatever else was handy. It was a kind of culinary recycling. Nothing wasted, everything masked. You pass a fishmonger and stop short. The air here is thick, heavy with the scent of the sea, and also of fish well past its prime. On the table are eels, their bodies limp and dull, flatfish with cloudy eyes, and a heap of small herring packed in salt. You recall that medieval cities far from the coast relied heavily on salted or dried fish, especially for Lent and other fasting days when meat was forbidden. Once again, preservation was both savior and curse. The fishmonger offers you a piece of stockfish, a dried cod so hard you could hammer nails with it. To cook it, you'd need to soak it for days, then boil it until tender. Even then, it would taste faintly of the long journey it had taken from the northern seas. Back in the butcher's quarter, you notice another trick: smoking. Strips of meat hang from rafters above a low fire, the smoke curling around them, sinking into every pore. The result is fragrant and durable, but also sometimes bitter. And if the firewood was poor quality, the smoke could leave an acrid aftertaste that clung no matter how you cooked it later. You think about the social implications. In a time when meat was expensive and preservation imperfect, to serve large quantities, even if salted to oblivion, was a display of wealth. A feast groaning with roasts and hams might impress guests, even if some of the flavor was more historically authentic than appetizing. And then there was the gamble of street food. In busy towns, meat pies were sold hot from portable ovens or stalls. They were convenient and delicious, but their fillings were a mystery. Scraps of meat, minced fine and heavily seasoned, could hide a multitude of sins. Some pies were famous for being more crust than content. Others were whispered to contain, well, whatever the cook could get that day. One baker grins as he hands you a steaming pie. You bite in and the crust crumbles beautifully. The filling is savory, peppery, with just enough fat to feel indulgent. You decide not to think too hard about which animal it came from, or when that animal last walked the earth. As you wander away, wiping crumbs from your fingers, you realize something. Meat in the Middle Ages was not just food, it was a test. A test of your wealth, your luck, and your stomach. You had to trust your nose, your cook, and sometimes your God. And yet, despite the risks, people craved it. Meat was a symbol of strength, prosperity, and celebration. On feast days, it was eaten with joy, no matter how much salt or spice it carried. Because in a hard life, the taste of meat, even imperfect, was worth the gamble. By the time you return to the inn, you can still smell the market clinging to your clothes. You sit by the fire, imagining the people who lived this every day, the ones who never questioned the meat in their stew because there was no alternative. And you think, with a shiver, that surviving medieval dining wasn't just about hunger. It was about courage. You might think that in a world before French fries and pizza, vegetables would have been the shining stars of the medieval table. After all, they're easy to grow, right? You can plant a seed, wait a while, and boom, you've got dinner sprouting in the yard. Surely the medieval diet must have been a rainbow of greens, roots, and pods. But no, not even close. In fact, vegetables in the Middle Ages had, let's say, an image problem. They were not glamorous. They were not symbols of wealth or sophistication. If anything, they were culinary wallflowers, hanging awkwardly around the edges of the feast while meat and bread danced in the spotlight. And in some cases, vegetables were downright suspicious. Picture yourself in a medieval village market. The morning mist is still curling between the thatched roofs, and vendors are laying out their goods. One stall is piled with turnips, another with cabbages. The colors are muted, earthy greens, dusty whites, pale yellows. No glossy tomatoes here, those won't arrive from the Americas until centuries later. No corn, no potatoes. Your choices are more rooty. A woman with a kerchief over her hair lifts a turnip the size of your fist and nods approvingly. Good for boiling, she says. And it's true, turnips could be boiled, mashed, roasted. But in the hierarchy of medieval food, they were at the bottom. Poor man's fare. If you were eating turnips, it was because you couldn't afford meat. Cabbage? Same problem. It grew easily and kept reasonably well, but it was considered coarse. Doctors and philosophers, yes, even food had philosophy back then, often warned that too much cabbage could cause melancholy vapors. Medieval medicine believed that food affected not just your body but your temperament. Cabbage, being damp and earthy, was thought to slow the mind. Peas and beans fared a little better, mostly because they could be dried and stored. Peasants relied heavily on them, especially in winter. A pot of pottage, that eternal stew bubbling on the hearth, might have beans, leeks, and carrots floating alongside whatever bits of meat or fat you could spare. But again, these were survival foods, not celebration foods. No lord would boast about serving a fine plate of beans to his guests. Historians still debate exactly how vegetables were perceived in different regions and classes. Some argue that peasants actually had a more balanced diet than nobles, simply because they ate more vegetables and fewer rich meats. Others point out that the cultural disdain for vegetables is clear in recipe books of the time, which often focus on meat, fish, and pastries, with vegetables playing supporting roles at best. As you wander past the stalls, you notice something else: the absence of bright colors. Carrots exist, but they're not the vivid orange you're used to, more likely pale yellow or purple. Beets are darker, more earthy. Greens like spinach are present but not common in all regions. And salads? Forget the modern idea of a crisp, fresh salad. The medieval version was more likely a mix of chopped herbs, vinegar, and maybe some onion, eaten as a digestive aid, not as a main dish. Then there's the matter of superstition. Certain vegetables carried reputations that had little to do with taste and everything to do with folklore. Onions, for example, were valued for their supposed ability to ward off illness, which is why you might wear one around your neck rather than eat it. Garlic was praised for its strength-giving properties, but also accused of causing bad humors if overindulged. Leeks, especially in Wales, had national pride attached to them, but even so, they were not the stuff of noble banquets. A leek pie might appear on a table, but it would be seen as humble fare. Radishes could be refreshing, but too many were thought to overheat the blood. You overhear a merchant muttering about cold and hot foods, and you remember that medieval dietetics divided foods according to the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every ingredient had qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and the goal was balance. Many vegetables were considered cold and wet, meaning they could make you sluggish or phlegmatic. Meat, by contrast, was hot and dry, perfect for giving vigor and energy, at least according to the medical wisdom of the time. So when nobles sat down to eat, they preferred foods that signaled wealth and health: meats, white bread, fine pastries. Vegetables might appear, but usually disguised, cooked with almond milk, baked into pies, or served as garnishes. To eat them plain was almost a statement of poverty. Yet for the majority of the population, vegetables were essential. They were the foundation of the diet, even if no one bragged about them. A peasant's dinner might be boiled barley with leeks, or a pottage with beans and carrots. In hard times, nettles and wild greens would be gathered from the hedgerows. Even acorns, after careful preparation, could be ground into flour for bread. You stop at a stall where a young boy is selling parsnips. They look like pale, twisted carrots. He explains that they're sweet when roasted, and indeed, in a world without sugar for most people, vegetables with natural sweetness were a treat. Parsnips, carrots, and beets could fill that role, but they still lacked the prestige of honey or fruit. Cooking methods were simple. Vegetables were often boiled, sometimes to oblivion. Long cooking made them soft and easy to digest, but also drained much of their flavor and nutrients. In richer households, they might be cooked in broths or with spices, but again, this was more to make them palatable than to celebrate them. As you sample a bit of boiled cabbage from a pot, you can't help but notice the way it has taken on the flavor of smoke from the hearth. The leaves are limp, the edges almost melting into the broth. This is comfort food, yes, but also survival food. You understand why it was rarely the star of the table. In the countryside, gardens were vital. Women tended plots with onions, garlic, leeks, peas, beans, and herbs. These gardens could make the difference between hunger and survival in winter. Still, the cultural narrative persisted. Vegetables were what you ate when you couldn't get something better. Even the language reflected it. To live on roots was a phrase for poverty. To eat like a lord meant meat, bread, and wine, not beans and cabbage. And yet, without those humble plants, the medieval diet would have collapsed. You finish your walk through the market with a small bundle of leeks, a sack of peas, and a head of cabbage. They're not glamorous, but they're honest. They carry the history of survival, of meals shared around smoky hearths, of gardens scratched from poor soil. And as you head back to your lodging, you realize something. The medieval table wasn't just about what people wanted to eat. It was about what they could afford, what their land could provide, and what their culture valued. Vegetables might not have been celebrated, but they kept people alive, and in their quiet way they still do. You set the leeks on the table, imagining the hands that planted them, the seasons they've seen, the soil they've drawn life from. In their unassuming form, they are a reminder. In history as in life, the things we overlook are often the things that sustain us most. You wake up in your narrow medieval bed, a bit stiff from the straw-stuffed mattress. The thin light of early morning slips through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Outside, you hear the clink of a bucket at the village well, the distant thud of an axe splitting wood, a rooster who sounds like he's still learning the job. Your stomach, however, is already awake. It lets out a hopeful little growl. You look around, expecting maybe a loaf of bread on the table or a jug of milk. But here's the thing. In the Middle Ages there was no such thing as breakfast. At least not in the way you know it. If you tell someone from the 14th century that you like to start your day with pancakes, scrambled eggs, and coffee, they might stare at you as if you've just described eating a feast in the middle of the night. For most medieval people, eating first thing in the morning was simply not the done thing. What? Well, there were a few reasons, some practical, some downright philosophical. First, there's the rhythm of life. In a world without electric light, your day started at dawn. You had work to do before you even thought about eating, milking animals, tending fires, hauling water. Food preparation took time, and the first big meal was often at mid-morning or even noon. And second, there was the influence of the church. Monastic rules and religious writings often associated early eating with greed or gluttony. To eat before a certain hour could be seen as giving in to bodily weakness. In many monasteries, the first meal of the day wasn't until after morning prayers, sometimes hours after sunrise. You stretch and wander outside. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. A neighbor passes with a yoke over his shoulders, 2 buckets swaying. He greets you and keeps walking. No offer of tea, no tray of toast. It's just not the culture. This isn't to say no one ever ate in the morning. Laborers who had to do heavy work early might grab a hunk of bread and a sip of ale before heading to the fields. But this was more of a snack than a formal meal, and it didn't have the cultural importance we attach to breakfast. It was called breaking the fast in the most literal sense, just something to keep you from fainting before the main meal. In many households, the first proper meal was dinner. Confusingly, this took place around what we'd call lunchtime. It was the largest meal of the day and the one people put the most effort into. Supper in the evening was lighter. That was it. 2 meals, no official breakfast in between. Historians still debate how strict this was. Some evidence suggests that wealthier people might have indulged in a morning bite, especially in later centuries. But the overall pattern held. The day was not framed around a morning feast. You wander into the town's main square, where market stalls are just setting up. A baker slides long loaves of coarse bread into his oven. The smell is tempting, warm, yeasty, comforting, but you know it'll be hours before most people buy one for a meal. Bread made in the morning might be eaten for dinner. Fresh baked doesn't necessarily mean eat it right now. Meanwhile, in a nearby monastery, the monks are deep in prayer. Only after several hours of chanting, reading, and working in the gardens will they sit down to eat. And even then, their meal will be modest, perhaps bread, cheese, and a bit of pottage. You think about how different this feels from your modern life. Today, breakfast is often marketed as the most important meal of the day. But that slogan is actually a 20th century invention, boosted by cereal companies and health campaigns. The medieval mindset was the opposite. Why feed the body first thing when you should be feeding the soul and getting to work? In cities, things could be a little more flexible. Merchants or officials who had to travel early might have a cup of watered wine or a bite of bread before leaving. But again, this was practical, not cultural. No one was writing poems about the joys of morning porridge. Speaking of porridge, oats, barley, or wheat boiled into a thick gruel, this was one of the few things you might find in a morning pot. It could be eaten at any time of day, but it was especially handy for those who needed quick fuel. Sweetening it with honey or adding dried fruit was a luxury though. Most of the time it was just grain and water, maybe with a pinch of salt. For the wealthy, there was always the option to break the rules. A nobleman rising late might ask for a small spread: bread, cheese, maybe cold meat from the night before. He might sip spiced wine or ale, especially if he was recovering from the previous evening's indulgence. But these were exceptions, not the norm. You pass by a field where a group of peasants are already at work, scythes swinging in slow, steady arcs. Their only refreshment so far has been a drink from a leather flask, ale most likely, since water was often unsafe. This small ale was weak in alcohol but provided calories and hydration. And yes, it counted as morning fuel. One woman, wiping her brow, mentions she'll eat when the sun is higher. No use eating too early, she says. Work first, then food tastes better. You realize this is part of the logic. After hours of labor, a meal feels more rewarding. Medieval meal times were also shaped by daylight and the seasons. In summer, when the days were long, dinner might be earlier, allowing for more work in the afternoon. In winter, with less daylight, meals shifted later, and the gap between waking and eating was shorter. But still, the idea of a structured morning meal never took root. Even travelers had to adapt. If you set out at dawn, you couldn't expect an inn to serve breakfast. At best, you might get some leftover bread or a mug of ale. Most inns focused on the main meals, and preparing food for early risers wasn't part of the business model. There were, of course, exceptions in certain trades. Fishermen heading out before sunrise might eat something small before rowing out. Soldiers on the march might be given rations early in the day. But these were more about necessity than comfort. In noble households, breakfast was sometimes associated with the sick or the very young, those who could not endure the long fast. To eat in the morning was almost to admit weakness. Some etiquette guides even suggested it was unseemly for healthy adults. You begin to realize that the absence of breakfast is tied to the medieval understanding of hunger and health. Food was fuel, but it was also a moral choice. Eating when you didn't need to could be seen as wasteful or indulgent. The body should be disciplined, not indulged. And then there's the social aspect. Without a shared morning meal, mornings were quieter, more solitary. People rose, did their chores, maybe exchanged a few words at the well or in the yard, but the real socializing happened at dinner. Meals were events, and spacing them out made them more significant. You imagine sitting in a great hall at noon, the long tables set with bread, meat, and ale, the air buzzing with conversation. After hours of fasting and work, the food is more than nourishment, it's a communal reward. So, as your stomach continues to grumble, you accept that you're living by medieval rules now. You grab a sip of ale from a passing jug, chew a corner of yesterday's bread, and get on with your chores. You'll eat properly later when the day's rhythm allows. It's a strange adjustment, but you can see the logic. Fewer meals mean less fuel spent on cooking fires, less wear on supplies, and a greater appreciation for what you do eat. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that by the time dinner comes, you enjoy it all the more. By late morning, the smells of cooking begin to drift through the air. Onions sizzling, bread cooling on wooden racks, broth simmering in iron pots. That's your cue. The fast is almost over. You've earned it. You step into the great hall of a medieval manor, and immediately you feel it, the weight of 100 eyes. Not hostile exactly, but expectant, judging, curious. You're not just here to eat, you're here to perform. Because medieval dining is not a casual affair. It's a ritual, a theater, a subtle battlefield where every gesture sends a message. The long wooden table stretches before you, heavy with platters, flagons, and trenchers. Richly dressed nobles and their retinues sit stiffly, their gazes flicking to you with a mix of amusement and scrutiny. You remember the old saying, "He who breaks bread must keep his manners." And here manners are the law. Before you even pick up your knife, a servant approaches with a basin of water and a cloth. This is no luxury, it's a necessity. You're expected to wash your hands, publicly, before the meal. Medieval food is eaten largely with fingers after all, and everyone's hands must be clean, or at least appear so. You dip your fingers gingerly, mindful that too slow a wash might look suspicious, but too fast might suggest impatience. Then comes the seating order. You don't just sit where you want. The Lord sits at the high table, the most honored spot. Below him, hierarchy descends in rows like a pyramid. Your place at the table is a direct reflection of your status. Sit in the wrong spot and you risk offense or worse, being seen as presumptuous. You spot a young noble fidgeting nervously because he's just realized he's seated too close to the Lord's favored squire. You suppress a smile. Been there. The social dance of dining is subtle, and any misstep might be remembered longer than a forgotten birthday. Once seated, you're handed your trencher, the thick slice of bread that doubles as your plate. This brings its own etiquette. The trencher isn't just your food, it's your tool and your plate, and it must be handled carefully. Break off bits only with your fingers, no biting directly from the bread is allowed, and use it to scoop up morsels. Licking your fingers while tempting is frowned upon, except for nobles who are allowed some leeway. You reach for your knife, a simple but sharp tool not just for cutting but for manners. You're expected to cut your meat into bite-sized pieces, and to avoid stabbing your food or waving your knife around wildly. A knife is a weapon as well as an eating utensil, so you wield it with respect. Sloppy cutting or reckless gestures might lead others to question your upbringing. Napkins? Forget it. Cloth napkins didn't exist in most places. You rely on the edge of your sleeve or your trencher to wipe fingers and mouth. There's a certain ruggedness to it, but also plenty of opportunity for embarrassment. Speaking of embarrassment, be careful with your elbows. Medieval etiquette warns against resting elbows on the table. It's seen as rude and coarse. But with no chairs designed for comfort and long tables cramped with plates and flagons, it's tempting to prop yourself up. You imagine all the times you've been scolded silently by a glare or a pointed comment from a passing servant. The noise level at the table is another subtle art. Loud chewing or burping is generally unacceptable, but some burping was tolerated as a sign that you enjoyed the meal. Spitting, coughing, or blowing your nose at the table? Absolutely taboo. You're expected to excuse yourself quietly for such business. Conversations are carefully moderated. You don't launch into loud debates or politics unless invited. Flattery of the Lord and his guests is standard. Jokes are welcome but must be witty and respectful. Imagine the pressure. Every word you say is weighed alongside your manners and eating skills. Then there's the matter of passing dishes. No passing plates directly hand to hand. Instead, food is pushed along the table from person to person, each guest sliding the plate down to the next. You have to be alert, lest you end up with food sliding off the edge or landing in someone's lap. You watch as a burly knight leans over too far, accidentally tipping a flagon of ale toward a lady's gown. She gasps, but he quickly mumbles an apology and offers a handkerchief, a rare luxury. The entire table's eyes turn to the mishap, and for a moment, tension flickers. Eating with your fingers means you must be adept at keeping your hands clean yet efficient. You're expected to eat neatly but also not too slowly. Meals were often timed to allow the Lord's agenda to continue. Dawdling or making a mess might suggest you're either starving or unrefined. Speaking of food, don't expect forks. They were a rarity and mostly used by monks or Italians far from here. Instead, you rely on knives and fingers. Spoons are common but reserved mostly for soups and stews. You remember how awkward it felt the first time you tried to eat a juicy piece of meat without a fork? There's a learning curve, especially with slippery sauces. And sauces were another etiquette minefield. Dipping your trencher in sauce was normal, but double dipping or licking the trencher's edge was not. Sauces ranged from sweet to sour to spicy, and each table had its own customs about which were acceptable. Using too much sauce was a sign of poor taste, but too little suggested stinginess. You notice a young squire nervously licking his fingers after a particularly succulent piece of meat. The elder lord gives him a sharp glance. "A gentleman never licks his fingers in public," he mutters. The boy blushes and tries to focus on his trencher instead. Even drinking had its own set of rules. Ale and wine were consumed in measured sips. Gulping down a cup was seen as vulgar. And you should never drink before the lord or the host does. You wait for the signal, the toast. And to toast properly, you clink your cup lightly, look your neighbor in the eye, and say a blessing or a witty phrase. Missing the eye contact or breaking the clink prematurely could be an insult or bad luck. You remember stories of guests who accidentally knocked over their cups or missed the toast, only to spend the rest of the evening trying to regain favor. Social survival at the table could be as tricky as surviving a battlefield. The topic of conversation was another regulated affair. Discussions of scandal, politics, or religion could be dangerous and were often avoided. Instead, tales of heroic hunts, family lineage, and recent battles were safe bets. Wit and humor were prized, but never at the expense of decorum. You also learn about the taboo of wasting food. Leaving a clean plate was a sign of poverty or poor health. Overeating was frowned upon too, as was eating too quickly. The goal was balance, to show you were well-fed but disciplined. You also learn about the taboo of wasting food. Leaving a clean plate was a sign of poverty or poor health. Overeating was frowned upon too, as was eating too quickly. The goal was balance, to show you were well-fed but disciplined. Then came the etiquette around leftovers. What you didn't eat often became scraps for dogs or servants. Nobles might throw bones to the hunting dogs or even toss some bits to the peasants outside, but in any case, wasting was a sin. The social dynamics played out in subtle ways too. Sharing food with someone was a sign of friendship or alliance. Passing a favored dish or offering a second helping could cement bonds. Conversely, ignoring a guest or not offering food could cause offense. You begin to appreciate how dinner was as much a display of power and status as it was about nourishment. The entire event was choreographed, down to how the napkins were folded, the placement of goblets, and the order of serving. Even the lighting, often candles or rushlights, was part of the ambience and etiquette. As the meal progresses, you notice how servants circulate silently, refilling cups, clearing plates, and observing the guests for any sign of dissatisfaction. They are trained to anticipate needs without being obtrusive, a skill that could make or break their position. You catch a glimpse of the Lord Steward signaling to the kitchen to bring out the next course. Courses were often multiple: soups, meats, pies, fruits, and each brought a new wave of etiquette challenges. How to eat certain pies without flinging filling. When to pause between courses. How to respond to compliments from the host. You watch a guest attempting to carve a particularly tricky roast. His awkward cuts elicit polite smiles, but you suspect the Lord notices. Presentation and handling of food was a form of language, and fumbling was frowned upon. The night wears on, and you find yourself both exhausted and exhilarated by the dance of manners, food, and social cues. You realize that, in medieval dining, what you eat is only half the story. The other half is how you eat it. As you prepare to leave, you remind yourself that breaking one rule might not ruin your entire reputation, but breaking several could have consequences far beyond embarrassment. Your place at the table, your alliances, and even your future could hinge on how well you navigated this ritual. You step out into the cool night air, the smells of roasted meats and spiced wine lingering. The great hall behind you hums with quiet conversation and laughter. You breathe deeply and wonder if you'd pass the test next time. You lean in to take a bite of what looks like a hearty stew, steam rising in lazy tendrils. The smell is rich and comforting: herbs, roasted meat, perhaps a hint of wine. Your mouth waters. But beneath this inviting surface lurks an invisible menace, one that medieval diners knew little about, yet feared in strange, indirect ways. Food safety in the Middle Ages was a patchwork of luck, tradition, and guesswork. There were no microscopes to reveal the tiny invaders waiting to turn a good meal into a disaster. No understanding of bacteria, viruses, or parasites as we know them today. Instead, illness was explained through humors, divine punishment, or miasmas, bad air. You swallow carefully, thinking about all the potential dangers hidden in your food. Let's start with bacteria, those microscopic agents of decay. In a world without refrigeration or modern sanitation, bacteria were everywhere. Meat sat out in warm kitchens, sometimes for days before cooking. Milk soured quickly. Bread was handled by many hands. Even water, often drawn from wells or rivers, could carry disease. Your stew might contain meat that was a day or two old, carried by a butcher who didn't have clean hands or clean tools. It might have been stored in a cellar that also held damp barrels of wine or piles of hay. The pot itself might have been rinsed with dirty water. All of these factors made contamination easy. Bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli could multiply rapidly, causing cramps, fever, or worse. People learned from bitter experience to be cautious. They boiled food for hours to kill off some of these invisible foes. But the knowledge was partial and inconsistent. You also have to consider the texture and appearance of food, which was one of the few tests medieval people used. For example, meat that smelled off or looked slimy would be avoided, or sometimes hidden beneath a thick layer of strong spices or vinegar to mask the smell. But these were unreliable methods at best. Interestingly, some historians have noted that medieval cooks developed surprisingly long cooking times as a way to improve food safety. Hours of simmering not only tenderized tough meats but also reduced many pathogens. Unintentionally, of course. You also have to consider parasites, tiny creatures that live inside animals and sometimes inside humans too. Trichinella, for example, could lurk in undercooked pork, causing trichinosis, a painful and sometimes deadly disease. Tapeworms might be contracted from raw or poorly cooked beef or fish. You picture a fishmonger by the docks, displaying salted herring and dried cod. The drying and salting helped preserve the fish, but without proper soaking and cooking, parasites could survive. And yet, fish was often eaten during religious fasts, making it a crucial protein source. The risk was accepted as part of the bargain. Worms in meat were common enough that some recipes include instructions for cleaning cuts carefully, but of course the microscopic larvae went undetected. Sometimes the presence of worms was taken as a sign the meat was fresh, paradoxically. This is one of those historical oddities still debated by scholars. Parasitic infections were widespread, especially in crowded towns and among those with poor sanitation. Intestinal parasites caused symptoms like fatigue, abdominal pain, and malnutrition, which were often attributed to other causes, such as imbalanced humors. Water too was a major vector. Wells near latrines or animal pens could become contaminated with bacteria and parasites like Giardia or Cryptosporidium. Drinking untreated water often led to gastrointestinal illness. People tried to avoid this by drinking ale or wine, which were safer due to fermentation. You sip your ale, thankful for the yeast's protective role. But even ale wasn't foolproof. The same barrels and vats used repeatedly without proper cleaning could harbor bacteria or wild yeast that spoiled the batch. Some alesh were known for their funky taste, which could mask off flavors or slight spoilage. And then there's the role of insects and rodents. Flies buzzed relentlessly around food, especially in open markets. They were carriers of disease and laid eggs on exposed meats or bread. Rats, common in medieval towns, rummaged through refuse and stores, spreading contamination. Imagine a humble peasant's pantry, sacks of grain stored in a corner infested with weevils, a barrel of salted pork with a few rat droppings nearby, a loaf of bread with maggots hidden inside. While you might recoil today, medieval people sometimes ate around these unwelcome guests out of necessity. The pest problem was so serious that medieval towns often had ordinances regulating refuse disposal and rodent control. But enforcement was patchy at best. Fleas on rats spread plague, and rats themselves found their way into kitchens and food stores. You wonder how they coped with illness. There were herbal remedies, prayers, and plenty of superstition. If you got sick, it might be blamed on bad humors, curses, or even witchcraft. The link between food and illness was recognized in a general sense, but the microscopic culprits remained a mystery. There are stories of entire households falling ill after a single contaminated meal. The rapid spread of disease was terrifying, especially when hygiene was poor and medical knowledge limited. Quarantines were rare and often ineffective. Instead, families and villages sometimes faced waves of sickness with no clear cause. Despite all this, people continued to eat. Hunger was a powerful motivator and the risk was accepted. Food was precious and wasting it was not an option. You think about the courage it took to trust that your meal wouldn't betray you, that the stew simmering on the fire would be nourishing, not deadly. You also recall that some foods were believed to have protective properties. Garlic, as you learned earlier, was thought to ward off disease. Spices like cinnamon and cloves were prized not just for flavor but for their supposed ability to purify or preserve. Sometimes these beliefs had a kernel of truth. Some spices do have antimicrobial effects, but mostly they were hopeful guesses. Washing hands before meals was recommended in some religious and medical texts, but not universally practiced. You remember dipping your fingers in that basin before dinner? More for ritual than effective cleaning. Soap was rare and water was precious. The kitchens themselves were hotspots for contamination. Pots were often shared, sometimes washed in the same water used for cleaning hands or floors. Meat scraps were reused in broths or pies, increasing the risk of passing on bacteria or parasites. You imagine the cooks scrambling to keep up with demand, slicing, boiling, and stirring while managing smoke, flies, and the ever-present threat of spoilage. It was a messy business and cleanliness was often a luxury. Some scholars suggest that medieval people developed surprisingly strong stomachs and immune systems through constant exposure to pathogens. Others argue that mortality rates, especially among children, were shockingly high due to foodborne illness. One curious fact you discover is that certain fermentation techniques, like sourdough bread making or cheese aging, might have helped reduce pathogens in food. Fermentation was widespread, it preserved foods and sometimes made them safer. But these methods varied greatly from place to place and mistakes were common. You think about the irony, the very foods that sustained medieval life were also potential sources of sickness. It was a delicate balance, one that required knowledge, experience, and often a bit of luck. You recall reading about the outbreak of food poisoning during medieval banquets, where guests would fall ill after consuming undercooked meat or contaminated fish. Sometimes, whole noble houses suffered terrible losses after such events. One famous example is the poisoning at the court of Charles VI of France, where mysterious illnesses swept through the nobles, possibly due to spoiled food or contaminated water supplies. The exact cause remains debated, but it illustrates the dangers even the rich faced. You imagine yourself at a grand feast, the tables groaning with food, unaware of the lurking dangers in each dish. The excitement of celebration mixed with the silent gamble of survival. Reflections on modern food safety. You finish your stew, cautiously savoring the last bite. You're grateful for the modern science that makes food safer today, but also impressed by the resilience of people who lived without it. Their meals were a daily gamble, a dance with unseen dangers that you'd never have to face. As you sit back, you realize that food safety isn't just about hygiene. It's about culture, technology, and survival. And the medieval feast, while brutal in many ways, was also a testament to human ingenuity in the face of invisible threats. You lift a wooden cup to your lips, feeling the coarse rim graze against your skin. The liquid inside is not the crystal clear water you might expect but a pale amber brew, cool and faintly frothy. It smells faintly of bread dough and damp cellars, with a bitterness that curls along your tongue as you swallow. You're not drinking for merriment tonight, not even for taste. You're drinking because in this world, clean water is a gamble, and the ale in your hand might be the safest thing available to you. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, water was not the default drink of life. It was a gamble, and for many it was a losing one. So instead, you live in a world where beer, ale, and wine flow like rivers. Not because everyone is trying to be jolly all day, but because they're trying not to die of dysentery before lunch. The problem begins the moment you imagine yourself walking to the nearest well in a medieval town. The streets between you and the well are narrow, packed with mud, refuse, and a steady trail of what the livestock have left behind. Rainwater runs down the sloped alleys, carrying with it things you'd rather not name. You stand there, waiting your turn, hearing the clank of the bucket chain as someone hauls water up from the depths. There's no modern cement lining, no sealed cover to keep the outside world from trickling in. That bucket might carry up a few twigs, some drifting leaves, or something you really wish were only a twig. What you don't see are the tiny, invisible killers that live in it: bacteria, parasites, viruses, things no one here has the words for, but everyone has buried relatives because of. Sometimes the water's taste itself tells you a story. A faint sulfur tang means it's been sitting too long. A metallic bite might mean it's run past the town's forge or picked up mineral traces from the soil. And the smell? Oh, the smell could be earthy and fresh, or it could remind you that the tannery is just upstream. People still drink it, of course, because there's no choice, but they know the risks. Stories pass between neighbors. Remember old Martin? Drank from the stream after the thaw, gone by week's end. You realize that in a place where life expectancy is already short, no one wants to shorten it further with a careless sip. In the countryside, far from crowded towns, you'd think things might be better. You walk along a dirt path past wheat fields, hearing the wind rustle the stalks. You come to a stream, sunlight glinting off the ripples. It looks pure enough to drink, but you notice the cows wading upstream, their hooves stirring the silt. That's where the problem lies. Water isn't treated, fenced, or diverted. Everyone, human or animal, shares the same supply. And with sharing comes contamination. Boiling is an option, but fuel is precious, and you're more likely to save that firewood for cooking the evening meal. So you begin to understand why ale and wine have become everyday necessities. The brewing and fermenting process may be imperfect, but it's enough to knock down some of the invisible threats. Monks know it, tavern keepers know it, and so do the women who brew in their own kitchens. The yeast does its bubbling magic, the heat of boiling mash does its quiet work, and what you get at the end is something that, while not exactly clean in the way you think of it, is safer than scooping straight from the river. The locals call it small beer when it's weak enough for children, and they drink it at breakfast, lunch, and supper without shame. In fact, you'd be stared at with suspicion if you refused to drink it. After all, why tempt fate with a mug of plain water? In the cities, breweries are as common as bakeries. The air in certain quarters smells faintly of malt and damp wood. You step into one of these places, a low, smoky room where a woman with strong arms is stirring a vat with a paddle taller than you. Steam rises, curling into the beams overhead. She glances at you and nods toward a bench. Around you, people sip from wooden tankards, some chatting, others lost in thought. The ale is thick, almost like a meal, and it fills you in a way water never could. This is hydration and calories in one, and for a laborer, it's a small comfort in a hard day. Wine is a different story. In the warmer southern lands or among the wealthy, wine is the preferred drink, though its journey from vineyard to cup is fraught with its own troubles. Barrels may leak, spoil, or sour in transit. Spices or honey might be added to mask off flavors, which makes you wonder just how far gone it was before it reached your table. And yet, it is still considered the more refined choice, poured carefully into goblets during feasts, diluted with water if strong, or sometimes with water that, ironically, might be less safe than the wine itself. Not that everyone in the medieval world is thrilled about alcohol as a daily staple. Preachers thunder from pulpits about the evils of drunkenness, warning that too much ale leads to sin. Town laws sometimes limit how much can be served to a single customer, though enforcement is another matter entirely. Still, even the moralists acknowledge that a little ale or wine keeps a person from falling ill. It is, in a strange way, both vice and virtue in the same cup. Every so often you see someone drink straight water. Maybe they've come from a rural well they trust. Maybe it's from a spring in the hills known for its clarity. There are even accounts of holy wells, believed to be touched by miracles, where the water is said to heal rather than harm. Whether it's faith or luck, some people do survive drinking raw water. But others are not so fortunate, and after a few too many tragedies, you start to see why communities lean on brewing as their safety net. There are debates, even among historians now, about just how dangerous medieval water truly was. Some argue that the fear is exaggerated, that in rural areas with clean springs, people drank water freely. Others point to the overwhelming evidence of waterborne diseases in urban records and insist the danger was very real. You standing here with your ale aren't thinking about historical debates. You're thinking about the pit in your stomach from last week when you drank from the wrong bucket and spent 2 days regretting it. Whatever the scholarly truth, your lived truth says fermented is safer. The taste of the drink itself becomes part of life's rhythm. You wake up and have a weak ale with bread. At midday, a stronger one with whatever stew is on the hearth. In the evening, perhaps wine if you're lucky, perhaps just more ale, maybe even a cider if apples were plentiful that year. You can't imagine a table without some kind of brew upon it. And when you travel, you carry a flask, not filled with water, but with something that has bubbled and brewed its way into being less of a gamble. Still, the irony isn't lost on you. You've traded one danger for another. Too much drinking dulls the senses, leads to mistakes, even fuels quarrels that turn bloody. Poorly stored barrels can grow mold or develop unpleasant flavors that are harmless to health but hard on the stomach. And yet, for all its flaws, the brew in your hand is still better than the murky liquid you saw scooped from the river this morning. Sometimes you pass children playing near a well, their mothers scolding them not to drink too much from the bucket. Instead, they're handed small mugs of ale, barely alcoholic, but enough to keep them safe. You think of your own childhood, if you had one in this time, and realize you'd have grown up with that taste as a constant, as familiar as milk or juice might be to you now. By the time the candle burns low, you've drunk your fill. The room hums softly with the quiet chatter of others doing the same. You feel a strange gratitude for this bitter, cloudy drink. It is a compromise, a cultural adaptation, a daily reminder that life in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about calculated survival. You set your cup down, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same choice again. Water with its invisible risks or ale with its familiar, bitter safety. And here, in this world, that's not really a choice at all. You sit down at a rough wooden table, the surface scarred with years of knife marks and stain from countless meals. The air is thick with smells you can't quite place. Something earthy, something smoky, and something faintly unsettling. A dish is placed in front of you, and before you even see it clearly, you know this is not going to be familiar. It's not that it's large or frightening. It's the opposite. Small, unassuming, and utterly alien to your modern expectations. You lean closer and realize that, yes, those are indeed tiny, glossy beetles, roasted until their shells gleam in the firelight. In the Middle Ages, the concept of weird food wasn't what it is for you now. The line between ordinary and strange was drawn differently, and survival had a way of making things acceptable. You might feel a shiver at the idea of crunching into a roasted beetle, but here it's just protein, and protein is precious. In some places, insects were not a curiosity, they were part of the seasonal rhythm of food. A swarm of locusts might mean famine if they ate your crops, but it might also mean a sudden windfall of meat if you caught them. People would roast them over the hearth, season them with whatever herbs were at hand, and eat them by the handful. Some records suggest that they were ground into flour, mixed into bread for extra nourishment, though historians still debate how common that really was. You watch as a man beside you cracks open what looks like a thin, brittle pod and picks out something wriggling inside, larvae of some kind, perhaps found under tree bark or in old logs. They're dropped into a pot with herbs, boiled until they curl and firm. You can't help but think that if you closed your eyes, you might just convince yourself it's pasta. Almost. The truth is, these small creatures are simply another form of sustenance in a time when winters were long and pantries were short on variety. Then there's the matter of what people pulled from rivers and ponds. Fish, of course, but not always the kind you expect. Lampreys, long and eel-like, with circular mouths full of teeth, were considered a delicacy in some courts. The sight of one might make your skin crawl, but in the kitchens of the wealthy, they were baked into pies or simmered in wine sauces. Their flavor, rich and oily, was celebrated by those who could afford them. Kings and nobles sometimes competed to present the largest or most exotic specimens at feasts, as if daring their guests to be impressed, or horrified. Not everything strange came from the animal world. You might be offered something green and spiny, a plant whose leaves bristle with fine needles. The locals might call it noble thistle, or some other charming name, but you recognize it as a relative of the modern-day artichoke or even cactus-like plants. Stripped of their spines, boiled and dressed with oil or vinegar, they can be surprisingly pleasant. The trouble is getting to the edible parts without injury. Some monasteries experimented with cultivating such plants, perhaps as a show of agricultural skill, or perhaps because they were simply curious about what could be eaten in the Lord's creation. Whether these prickly vegetables were everyday fare or rare curiosities is still debated among scholars, but the records suggest at least some adventurous souls were willing to try them. There were also the plants that defied easy categorization: seaweeds gathered from rocky shores, mosses scraped from stones, lichens boiled until soft. In times of scarcity, these could become staples, though they might also appear on the tables of the wealthy as novelty items, dyed with spices or arranged in elaborate patterns. Imagine sitting at a feast, nibbling on what you're told is a rare delicacy from the coast, only to realize it's essentially the same stuff clinging to the rocks near the village dock. Perception, it seems, is everything. And then, of course, there is the matter of amphibians. Frogs' legs are familiar enough in some cuisines today, but in the medieval world, they could be both a humble pondside snack and a symbol of refinement. Some records describe them battered and fried, others boiled with herbs. To you, the sight of someone reaching into a pot and pulling out a pale, jointed leg might be unsettling, but to the people here, it's simply dinner. There's even a curious tension in the records. Some religious authorities frowned upon eating frogs, lumping them in with unclean creatures, while others saw no problem at all. The argument, apparently, could get quite heated for such a small piece of meat. Birds, too, came in a bewildering variety. You might expect chickens, ducks, or geese, but you're just as likely to be served swan, peacock, or even small songbirds. The latter were sometimes roasted whole, bones and all, and eaten as a bite-sized treat. Peacocks, meanwhile, were often roasted and then redressed in their own feathers for presentation, a spectacle meant to dazzle guests. The taste, by all accounts, was not particularly remarkable, tough and gamey, but the display mattered more than the flavor. Sometimes, the strangeness lies not in the creature itself but in how it's prepared. A fish might be cooked in almond milk, stuffed with raisins and cinnamon, flavors you associate with dessert. A bird might be boiled in wine until the meat is tinted purple. There's a fascination with combining sweet and savory in ways that feel unexpected to you now but were perfectly normal then. Historians still argue over whether this was a matter of taste, status, or simply the availability of certain spices and sugars. And let's not forget the fermented and preserved oddities, cheeses so aged and ripe they could walk off the table on their own, jars of pickled fish heads, smoked entrails and dried blood puddings. Some of these, especially the blood-based dishes, were considered highly nutritious, a way of using every part of the animal. You might hesitate, but here wasting food is unthinkable. You also encounter things that feel halfway between medicine and food. Ground animal bones mixed into bread for extra calcium, powdered antlers stirred into broth, or tonics made from steeping herbs and live insects together. These are believed to strengthen the body, ward off illness, or restore vigor. Whether they actually work is uncertain. Modern science might scoff, but in a time when remedies are as much about tradition as evidence, these concoctions are part of the culinary landscape. Your host for the evening, a cheerful woman with flour on her sleeves, brings out the final surprise, a pie with a golden crust. You cut into it expecting fruit or meat, but instead you find it writhing. Not alive, the heat has done its work, but filled with eels, small and silver, their bodies coiled in the filling. She assures you it's a special dish for honored guests. You take a bite, the rich, oily flavor flooding your mouth. It's strange, but you can see how one might grow used to it. The more you eat, the more you realize that the line between delicacy and disgust is drawn by culture, by necessity, and by the stories people tell about their food. Some of these dishes are born of scarcity, others of abundance and curiosity. Some might never have been common at all, lingering only in the records of feasts and festivals, leading historians to wonder if they were novelties rather than staples. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. As the evening ends, you lean back, the firelight flickering against the walls. You've tasted beetles, lampreys, prickly plants, and pies filled with eels. Some of it surprised you, some of it challenged you, and some of it, you might even miss. You realize that in this world, weird is just another word for normal somewhere else, and that your own diet might look just as strange to someone centuries from now. The thought makes you smile as you set down your cup, ready for whatever tomorrow's meal might bring. You wake to the sound of bells. Not the gentle single chime of a monastery announcing the hour, but a jubilant, chaotic chorus, each bell pulling in its own direction, tumbling over one another in an eager rush. Today the air feels different. The streets are alive, the smell of wood smoke thicker than usual, mingled with something richer. Fat melting over flames, bread baking, spices blooming in hot wine. The entire village seems to have been drawn outside, pulled by invisible threads toward the square. It's a feast day. The timing is no accident. This celebration may be pinned to a saint's feast or a harvest festival, or perhaps the wedding of a noble family. The date may be tied to the church calendar or to the cycles of planting and reaping. But whatever its origin, it's one of the rare days when food seems endless, and the usual rules of scarcity bend or break entirely. You can feel the collective exhale. Today is about abundance, spectacle, and eating until you're too full to move. The first thing you notice is the sheer quantity of bread. Great, round loaves stacked like miniature hills, their crusts dark and crackling. Bakers have been up since before dawn, pulling loaves from their ovens in a steady rhythm. Some are simple, just flour, water, salt, while others are enriched with honey or studded with dried fruits, luxuries reserved for days like this. You take a piece of one still warm from the oven, the crumbs soft and fragrant. Already you feel the steady pull of comfort. But bread is just the beginning. In one corner of the square, a man turns a spit the length of his arm, skewered through an entire pig. The skin is blistering, crackling, dripping fat into the fire below. The smell alone is enough to stop you in your tracks. Around the pig are smaller spits, geese, ducks, and chickens turning slowly, their juices hissing where they meet the coals. There's an ease in the way people approach the fire, slicing off a sliver here, catching the drips of fat with hunks of bread. On any other day, such casual sampling might earn you a sharp word, but today generosity is expected. Further on, you see dishes that strain your sense of familiarity. A pie the size of a cartwheel, its crust ornately decorated, is cut open to reveal, not apples, not meat, but an eruption of live birds. They scatter into the sky in a flurry of wings, the crowd laughing in delight. The pie itself, once the performance is over, turns out to be filled with minced meat, sweet spices, and dried fruit, rich enough to coat your mouth with every bite. Then there are the more theatrical displays. A roasted peacock, its feathers carefully reattached after cooking so that it appears at first glance to be alive and in full splendor. A swan, neck curved in regal repose, its white plumage gleaming. In both cases, the meat is said to be more about display than flavor, but that doesn't stop people from slicing off portions to taste. You try a piece of the peacock out of curiosity, finding it gamier than you expect, the texture dense. Not bad, just different. Wine flows freely. It's not the refined, perfectly clear liquid you might imagine, but cloudy, sometimes sweet, sometimes sharp, often flavored with herbs, spices, or honey. Large pitchers are passed from hand to hand, and everyone drinks, even children, though theirs may be heavily watered down. You try a cup of mulled wine, the heat from the spices and the alcohol rising in your chest. Beside the wine, barrels of ale and mead are rolled out, the foam spilling over as mugs are dipped straight in. This is not a day for moderation. In the center of it all, a massive table, or rather, a series of tables pushed together, groans under the weight of food. There are roasted joints of venison, the meat dark and rich, sliced into generous slabs. Bowls of stewed beans and lentils, fragrant with herbs, sit alongside dishes of pickled vegetables meant to cut through the heaviness of the meat. Platters of fish, pike, trout, and carp, gleam with oil, garnished with sprigs of rosemary or dill. Some have been poached in wine, others baked in pastry, still others fried and sprinkled with vinegar. You notice that sweetness is not confined to dessert. Meat dishes are often laced with sugar, honey, or dried fruits. The combination of savory and sweet is striking, and at first it feels jarring, but the more you taste, the more you understand that this is part of the medieval idea of luxury. Sugar is precious, imported from far away, and using it in abundance signals wealth. You bite into a pigeon pie and find the filling studded with prunes and spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The flavor is rich, heady, and strangely addictive. The crowd's energy builds as the afternoon wears on. Minstrels play near the edges of the gathering, their songs half drowned by the noise of conversation and laughter. Children dart between the legs of the revelers, chasing each other or sneaking bits of bread. Somewhere nearby, a juggler keeps 3 apples in the air, occasionally snatching one for a bite mid-performance. As the sun dips lower, the feasting does not slow. More dishes emerge from kitchens and hearths, sausages spiced with garlic and pepper, fritters fried until golden, bowls of porridge enriched with cream and honey. A woman offers you a slice of almond cake, dense and fragrant, the texture almost fudgy. It's the kind of food you know will sit heavily in your stomach, but you take a second slice anyway. By now, the edge of hunger is long gone, replaced by the curious compulsion to keep tasting, to sample just one more thing. You find yourself seated next to an elderly man who tells you with great pride about the times when the feast would last for days, food brought out in waves so that no one could ever finish it all. He gestures to a platter of tiny songbirds roasted whole, encouraging you to try one. The flavor is intense, the meat rich and slightly bitter, the crunch of bones unexpected but oddly satisfying. Somewhere between the wine, the laughter, and the endless stream of dishes, you realize that these festivals are as much about showing off as they are about eating. The wealthy use them to display their generosity, to reinforce bonds with their neighbors and tenants. The poor use them as a rare chance to eat their fill, to taste things they might never encounter otherwise. And everyone, regardless of rank, uses them as an excuse to forget, just for a while, the constant shadow of scarcity. There's also an undercurrent of ritual in all this. Certain foods appear only at specific feasts. Lamb at Easter, goose at Michaelmas, fish-heavy spreads during Lent. In some cases, the choice is tied to religious symbolism. In others, it's simply tradition, repeated until it feels like part of the natural order. You watch as a group of monks carefully prepare a dish of spiced fish, explaining that it has been made the same way for generations. By nightfall, the square is lit with torches, their flames dancing in the breeze. The music shifts to slower songs, and people begin to gather in smaller groups, talking quietly or simply sitting together in companionable silence. You sip the last of your wine, your senses dulled but content. Around you, the remains of the feast are still being picked over, half a pie here, a hunk of bread there, bones stripped of their meat. Tomorrow, much of what's left will be salted, pickled, or otherwise preserved, the festival's abundance stretched into the lean days ahead. As you make your way home, your stomach heavy and your head light, you think about how alien this would feel in your own time. The combination of strange flavors, elaborate displays, and the sheer indulgence of eating without restraint, it's intoxicating and overwhelming all at once. And yet, for the people here, it's as natural as the changing of the seasons. Feasts are rare, but when they come, they are lived to the fullest, a burst of color and flavor against the long gray stretches of the everyday. Even in the quiet that follows, you can feel the pulse of the day lingering in your bones. Tomorrow will return to the usual rhythm of bread and broth, but tonight, you carry the memory of roasted peacock, spiced wine, and the joyful chaos of a medieval feast. You know now that behind the spectacle lies a very human need, not just for food but for moments that break the monotony, that remind everyone, no matter their place in the world, that life can be celebrated. You wake to the scent of herbs drifting in through the shutters, sharp, green, almost medicinal. It's the kind of smell that makes you wonder if someone is cooking or if someone is treating an illness. In the medieval world, those two activities are not always separate. Here, the kitchen is also the apothecary, and the apothecary might be tucked into a kitchen corner. Food and medicine blend so thoroughly that a spoonful of broth could just as easily be considered a treatment as it is a meal. You hear the clatter of wooden bowls downstairs and follow the sound. In the kitchen, a woman is stirring a pot with great seriousness, muttering under her breath as she tosses in dried sprigs of something that smells faintly of licorice. She isn't just making soup, she's making a cure. The broth is cloudy with barley, onions, and a scattering of chopped herbs, and floating in the steam is a confidence that this will heal whatever needs healing. Cough, fever? A stomach that has been uncooperative? The same pot might be called upon for all three. It's worth remembering that in this world, The very idea of medicine is rooted in taste, texture, and the theory of balance. The guiding principle is the humoral system. 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with qualities like hot, cold, wet, and dry. Illness comes from imbalance, and food is one of the main tools to restore harmony. If you are considered cold and wet, you need foods that are hot and dry to rebalance you. So a spiced wine might not just be an indulgence, it might be your doctor's prescription. Someone presses a cup into your hand, warm and fragrant. You take a sip and taste honey, cinnamon, perhaps a hint of ginger. This, you're told, is to strengthen the stomach and warm the blood. Whether it does either is uncertain, but it's undeniably comforting. You also quickly notice how expensive this concoction must be. Ginger and cinnamon are imported from far away, so their presence signals care, effort, and perhaps even a little luxury. On the table nearby sits a pile of garlic bulbs, their papery skins flaking off in layers. Garlic here is more than just flavor, it's armor. It's believed to repel not only bad humors but also the evil vapors that bring sickness. Someone tells you to chew a clove raw if you feel a cold coming on, though you suspect that doing so might repel more than just illness. It might clear an entire room. Still, there's an earnest belief in its power, and that belief is as much a part of the cure as the ingredient itself. Then there's pottage, a thick, porridge-like stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat, served steaming in a wooden bowl. On a normal day it's just food. But with the right additions it becomes a remedy. Add leeks and sage and it's for a cough. Add fennel and parsley and it's for windiness, which is exactly what it sounds like. Add crushed almonds and honey, and it becomes a restorative for someone weak after illness. The line between lunch and treatment is blurry enough that you could eat your medicine without even realizing it. In one corner of the kitchen, jars line a shelf, dried chamomile flowers, rosemary sprigs, powdered ginger, and something labeled in a spidery hand as dragon's blood. The last turns out to be not from dragons at all but a red resin from certain trees, used to staunch bleeding and color medicines. The medieval world loves exotic names. They make a treatment sound more potent, more magical. Even ground-up emeralds have been prescribed, though you can't help wondering if that was just an excuse for the wealthy to eat gemstones. A small child wanders in, sniffling, and is handed a cup of warm milk with saffron stirred into it. The golden color is beautiful, glowing like sunlight in the dim kitchen. Saffron is another rare import, and its presence in a child's cup speaks of either great care or the hope of impressing visitors. The taste is delicate, but the symbolism is powerful, golden food for restoring vitality. Whether or not it works, you can see how the gesture alone might comfort a worried parent. Not every remedy makes sense, at least not to you. There are recipes that call for bread soaked in ale and then wrapped around a sore throat, supposedly to draw out the illness. There's a suggestion that eating roasted eel can help with earaches. And somewhere in a well-thumbed manuscript, you read that powdered deer antler is good for strengthening the heart, though the exact mechanism remains mysterious. You begin to realize that medieval medicine is as much about symbolic thinking as it is about empirical results. Outside, you find a small herb garden tucked against the side of the house. Even the poorest households often keep one. Here grow the staples of both kitchen and medicine chest: thyme, mint, rue, and hyssop. Some are for seasoning meat, others for steeping in teas, others for grinding into paste to apply to wounds. You touch a leaf of sage and release a peppery, resinous scent. The woman tending the garden tells you that sage is good for everything except death. You're not sure if she's joking. In the market, you see the overlap of food and medicine everywhere. Vendors sell candied fennel seeds for sweetening the breath and settling the stomach. Dried figs are praised for their laxative properties. Almonds are said to be good for the brain, especially if eaten with honey. And spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, are recommended not just for flavor but for preserving health by warming the body. A merchant leans in conspiratorially to tell you that a pinch of nutmeg each morning will keep you vigorous, though his eagerness to sell you a pouch makes you question the advice. At the feast table, you notice how many dishes are served with sauces heavy in herbs and spices. You're told that these aren't just for taste, they help open the digestion, preventing food from rotting in the stomach. Vinegar is another favorite, used liberally in dressings and sauces. It's praised for its ability to cut through phlegm and cool excessive heat, though you suspect it's also just a reliable way to make questionable meat taste better. You are offered a small sweetmeat, honey mixed with ground spices and pressed into a little ball. This, you're told, is a comfort eaten at the end of a meal to close the stomach. The logic is almost poetic. You open the stomach with certain flavors at the start, fill it with food, then close it again with others. Whether or not this has any actual effect on digestion, it creates a sense of ritual that makes eating feel more complete. One afternoon, you are invited to watch the making of a special tonic for the lord of the manor, who has been feeling the cold in his bones. The preparation is elaborate. Red wine simmered with rosemary, cloves, ginger, and a handful of dried rose petals. The smell is intoxicating, floral and spicy all at once. The finished drink is presented in a silver goblet, and the Lord sips it as though it were the most precious liquid in the world. Perhaps it's the warmth of the wine, perhaps the comfort of being cared for, perhaps the placebo effect. But by the next day, he is said to be much improved. There's also the curious habit of prescribing certain foods for emotional states. Feeling melancholy? Eat roast partridge, said to lift the spirits. Feeling anxious? A broth made with lettuce and violets is supposed to calm the mind. You can't help noticing that the medieval approach to mental health involves a lot of gentle, warm meals, a form of edible comfort that feels surprisingly timeless. Of course, some treatments sound more like punishments. If you have a fever, you might be advised to drink a decoction of bitter herbs and vinegar. If you have indigestion, you could be told to swallow raw egg yolks beaten with mustard. And if you have a toothache, someone might suggest holding a roasted onion in your mouth, which you suspect is less about curing the pain and more about distracting you from it. The learned physicians of the time often write long lists of dietary rules for health: what to eat in each season, which meats are light and which are heavy, how to combine foods to prevent imbalance. They might warn against eating fruit without first correcting it with spices or wine, or caution that too much cold, wet food in winter will weaken the spirits. It's a constant balancing act, part science, part superstition, part culinary art. By the end of your stay, you've eaten more medicinal dishes than you can count. Some have been genuinely pleasant: a honeyed almond milk thickened with rice flour, a clear chicken broth with parsley and lemon. Others have been less so, like the barley porridge laced with bitter wormwood you were urged to finish for your liver's sake. And through it all, you've begun to understand that in this world, food is not just fuel or pleasure. It is an active tool for shaping the body's health, for maintaining the balance between sickness and wellness. Walking away from the hearth one evening, you think about how different your own time is. You separate medicine from food, prescriptions from recipes. But here the two are inseparable. A kitchen is a pharmacy, a meal is a treatment, the act of feeding someone is an act of healing. Even when the logic doesn't quite make sense, there's something deeply human in the impulse to care for others by nourishing them, to believe that a well-seasoned broth can set the world right again. And maybe, as you sip another mug of warm, spiced wine before bed, you start to believe it too. You are standing at the edge of a muddy lane that smells faintly of wood smoke and boiled cabbage. The day is gray, the kind that makes every chimney plume seem thicker, every doorway feel like a secret worth stepping into. This is no noble manor kitchen. This is the home of a category, and if you're expecting tables piled with roast meat and trays of golden pies, you'll be sorely disappointed. But if you came looking for ingenuity, real, hard-earned, necessity-born creativity, then you're in exactly the right place. Inside, the warmth hits you like a soft blanket. The air is dense with the smell of simmering something, though you can't quite tell what it is yet. The hearth is small but determined, a little iron pot hanging over the flames, its lid rattling now and then as steam escapes. This is where survival cooking happens, where scraps are transformed into sustenance. The woman tending the pot doesn't greet you so much as wave you to sit, her hands too busy coaxing flavor from the unlikeliest of ingredients. A quick glance around tells you everything about this household's food situation. There's no pantry stacked with flour sacks, no barrels of salted meat, no pyramids of gleaming apples. Instead, there's a handful of onions in a basket, a small crock of lard, a few turnips that have seen better days, and a pot of something that might once have been stew but now looks like a long-simmered memory of it. Yet in the category's eyes this is enough. More than enough if you know what to do with it. She lifts the pot lid and stirs. You catch a glimpse of shredded greens, some kind of root vegetable, and a bone, barely any meat clinging to it, rolling lazily in the broth. That bone might have been gnawed clean days ago in another household, but here it's still working. Every bit of marrow, every trace of flavor, is coaxed out through slow cooking. In this kitchen, bones are currency. The richer folk may throw them away without thought, but here they're boiled, reboiled, scraped, pounded, until they give up every last ghost of nourishment. The bread you're handed is coarse and dark, heavy with bran. It's not the soft white bread of the upper classes, made from fine milled wheat. This is rye or barley bread, maybe mixed with pea or bean flour to stretch the precious grain. It's dense, almost sour, but it fills the stomach. You tear off a piece and dunk it into the stew, the bread soaking up the thin broth like a sponge. It's not glamorous, but it's warming. And when you're working the fields all day, that warmth matters more than delicacy. Pottage is the lifeblood here, an endlessly adaptable, perpetually simmering stew of whatever's available. It can be humble to the point of being just water, herbs, and a scrap of fat, or it can be rich, when the occasional bit of bacon rind, leftover porridge, or a wild rabbit makes its way in. It's not a dish that's cooked fresh each day so much as it's a living thing, always on the fire, always changing as new ingredients are added and old ones ladled out. In some homes, you might taste centuries of history in the pot, or at least a week's worth of flavors layered one upon another. When meat does appear on the poor table, it's often not the cuts you'd find at a feast. It's offal, liver, kidneys, tripe, or parts most modern diners wouldn't think twice about discarding. These are chopped small, boiled long, and seasoned with whatever herbs can be foraged. A pot of liver and onions might sound unremarkable now, but here it's cause for genuine excitement. The flavors are deep and earthy, the kind of taste that tells you you're eating something real, something from the very core of the animal. Herbs are gathered from the hedgerows: nettles, dandelion leaves, sorrel. They're not just for seasoning, they are the vegetables. In early spring, when winter stores have dwindled, these greens are the first fresh food to appear, and they're greeted like long-lost friends. You watch as a handful of nettles is thrown into the pot, the sting tamed by the heat, their bright green turning a deep, nutritious olive. For sweetness, there's no sugar, it's too expensive, but maybe a dab of honey if a neighbor keeps bees, or more often, the natural sweetness of roasted root vegetables. A carrot, split and slowly baked in the hearth embers, turns into a soft, caramel-scented treat. Children wait for these like their festival candy, burning their fingers a little as they peel away the charred skin to get to the molten core. Fish, if you live near a river or coast, is another lifeline. But here again, the poor eat what the wealthy don't want: small, bony fish, salted herring, or eels caught in muddy shallows. Eels in particular are surprisingly prized. They're fatty, filling, and can be smoked or stewed. The smell might not win over everyone, but when you've been hungry enough, it's amazing how quickly acquired taste becomes favorite food. Some of the most ingenious dishes are born not from abundance but from scarcity. Bread crusts are saved and boiled into a thick soup with onions and a bit of fat. Old porridge is fried into cakes the next day, crisp on the outside, soft within. The whey left over from making cheese becomes the base for soups or is drunk outright, tangy and nourishing. Nothing is wasted, not even the water vegetables are boiled in, which might be used to bake bread, lending it both moisture and flavor. There's an unspoken skill here, one that doesn't make it into the history books as often as the elaborate recipes of royal kitchens. It's the ability to look at what little you have and see possibilities instead of limits. A few scraps of bacon fat flavor an entire pot. A pinch of dried herbs foraged months ago can make a dish taste fresh. Even ashes from the hearth might be sifted for lye to make soap, which in turn frees up animal fat for cooking instead of washing. But it's not all romantic resilience. Sometimes the poor have to eat things the wealthy consider outright refuse. Animal skin, gristle, the gelatin scraped from bones after boiling, or bread so stale it needs to be soaked before it can be chewed. And there are cooking methods still debated by historians today. Did some truly eat blood pancakes made from livestock blood mixed with flour and fried? The evidence is scattered, but in a world where no calorie could be wasted, it's not hard to believe. Likewise, certain field pies are described in records. Pies made with whatever could be gathered, from hedgerow berries to mashed snails. Whether they were common or exceptional is unclear, but the fact they were recorded at all suggests they were at least known. The sharing of food is as important as the food itself. In a poor village, if one family manages to catch a fish or snare a rabbit, it's common to share at least a little with neighbors. Not because it's easy, but because you know they'll do the same for you. In lean months, that reciprocity can mean the difference between surviving the winter or not. Even mealtime here has its own quiet ritual. There's no formal setting of the table, no separate courses. A single pot is brought to the center, and everyone takes what they need with wooden spoons or pieces of bread used as scoops. Conversation is low, partly because you're too busy eating, partly because in a world where food is precious, there's an unspoken reverence for the act of consuming it. And when the pot is scraped clean, there's a kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with extravagance. You've eaten, you're warm, and you've shared the experience with others. That's its own kind of feast. You begin to see why, for all the hardships, people remember even the simplest dishes from their childhood kitchens with such deep fondness. As you step back out into the cold air, belly full of humble stew and rough bread, you realize something. Luxury isn't always about gold plates or rare spices. Sometimes it's about the skill to make something from nothing, to take the overlooked and the unwanted and turn it into something sustaining. And that's a kind of wealth you can't measure in coin. You are ushered into the great hall long before the feast begins, because here, dining is as much a theater performance as it is a meal. The space feels enormous, the kind that swallows up footsteps into its vaulted wooden ceiling, yet every corner hums with preparation. Servants in livery hurry about, arms full of platters and ewers, their shoes whispering over fresh rushes that have been scattered across the floor. The rushes are mixed with herbs, sweet woodruff, chamomile, perhaps even lavender, so that when feet shuffle or skirts swish, there's a faint fragrance in the air to mask the smoke from the central hearth. The hearth itself is a drama in progress, spits turning with whole animals, deer, boar, geese, slowly browning, the fat dripping into pans below, hissing as it meets the heat. A haze of wood smoke mingles with the perfume of roasting meat and the sharper scent of spice, the kind that makes your nose twitch. Cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, pepper. These are not casual seasonings. Each pinch has been carried by ship and camel from far-off lands, and each grain is proof of wealth. They are sprinkled not with precision but with abandon, like a painter throwing gold dust across a canvas, because restraint in spice is for those who must ration their supply. You glance at the long trestle tables set for the guests. Each place has a knife, yours to bring and keep, as well as a spoon but no fork. Forks are viewed with suspicion here, as if two-pronged bits of metal might be decadent or even foreign in a way that feels untrustworthy. Instead, fingers and knives will do the work, and bread trenchers will double as both plate and sponge. The bread at your place is pale, soft, and unnaturally white, the kind that only comes from the most finely bolted flour. You've eaten bread before, of course, but nothing like this. It feels almost weightless in your hand, as though it has traded its hardiness for elegance. You already know it will fill your stomach without quite feeding you. The high table, set upon a dais, is dressed with embroidered cloth and flanked by tall silver candlesticks. Candles burn even though it's still afternoon. Light is a luxury here, and what better way to flaunt it than to spill it unnecessarily? At the center of the high table sits a salt cellar of intricate design, heavy and gleaming. Salt is common enough in your own time, but here it's a symbol. Its placement determines who sits above the salt, close to the host, important, or below the salt, lesser status. Even seasoning becomes a quiet code of hierarchy. When the lord and lady enter, conversation hushes as if the air itself has taken a step back. The lady's gown glitters faintly with stitched pearls, the lord's tunic heavy with embroidery and fur. They sit and the meal begins. It begins, oddly enough, not with food but with ritual. Hands are washed in a basin brought by a servant, scented with rose water. Bread is blessed. Then the first course arrives, not a single dish but a procession of them. You try to take it all in. Venison in a sauce so dark it's nearly black, heavy with wine and pepper. Capon stuffed with almonds and raisins. Fish pie decorated with a pastry crest. And there, a marvel. A roasted peacock, its jewel-toned feathers reattached after cooking, so that it appears alive and regal, a centerpiece no one will actually enjoy eating. Peacock meat is tough, but that hardly matters. It's here for show. This, you realize, is the heart of noble dining. Display, display, display. The dish is a conversation piece, a symbol of wealth and reach, a reminder that your host's household can afford the impractical. The wine is poured freely, though it's nothing like the crisp or dry wines you might know. It's sweet, mulled, sometimes thickened with egg whites or sweetened with honey and sugar until it resembles a drinkable dessert. Between courses, hippocras is served, spiced wine intended to aid digestion, though it coats your tongue in sweetness and clings to your teeth. You sip politely but notice the older men at the table favoring it heavily, their cups refilled as soon as they're drained. Perhaps it's a habit, perhaps a preference, perhaps a way to blur the evening's sharper edges. Course after course arrives and each feels heavier than the last. Fat is everywhere, rendered in sauces, smeared on bread, glistening atop roasted meats. Nobles are not shy about richness. It is, in fact, a point of pride. But you notice the toll it takes. A man across from you, dressed in deep green velvet, excuses himself to stand and stretch, his face pinched. You've heard the term gout whispered already this evening, and now you think you see it. Swollen joints, discomfort hidden behind courtly manners. In this world, gout is almost a badge of honor. Proof that you have eaten well and often. Fruits and vegetables make rare appearances. In summer there might be fresh berries or herbs, but now the offerings are preserved. Dried figs, raisins, quince paste. There's a belief, still debated among scholars, that certain raw vegetables can upset the balance of humors, leading nobles to avoid them. Peasant tables, ironically, may be more balanced in this respect out of necessity. Here, fresh produce is not the star of the show. The stars are meat, sugar, and spice. One dish surprises you: lamprey eel stewed in wine. It is rich, strange, and slightly metallic on the tongue. In your own time, eating lamprey might seem shocking, even controversial, but here it's a delicacy. The lord at the high table praises its tenderness, while a few guests pick at it cautiously. Historians still argue about how common such dishes were, whether they were rare treats or staples for those who could afford them. And then the pie. It's enormous, its crust golden and slightly glossy. When it's cut open, there is a flurry of motion. Live birds, hidden inside before baking, now bursting forth in a cloud of feathers and startled chirps. The hall erupts in laughter and applause. This too is food as spectacle, an echo of a line in old songs about 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. You're impressed, yes, but you also wonder how much of this feast is truly about taste, and how much about reminding every guest of the household's wealth and imagination. Between the heavier courses, servants bring trenchers to collect grease and sauces. These bread plates soak up everything but are rarely eaten by the nobles. Instead, they'll be given to the poor after the feast, a charitable gesture that doubles as waste disposal. The poor will eat them gladly. You can't help wondering how grateful they'd be for fresh bread instead. The evening stretches on, and so does the eating. Entertainment threads through the courses. Musicians with lutes, a jester tumbling for laughs, a storyteller spinning tales of hunts and battles. Each act gives the guests time to rest between bites, for the sheer volume of food would be impossible to consume otherwise. By the time the final dishes appear, candied almonds, marchpane shaped into castles, sugar sculptures dusted with gold leaf, you feel both awed and slightly unwell. The excess is dizzying. You think of the health risks, the endless sugar contributing to tooth decay, the meat-heavy diet straining the body, the lack of fresh fiber slowing digestion. You see the subtle signs all around you: hands swollen from gout, smiles that hide missing teeth, the way some guests avoid the more heavily spiced dishes as if they've learned the hard way. You leave the hall at last, stepping into cool night air, and it feels like emerging from a storybook, one in which every page is illuminated with gold leaf, but where the gilding hides a fragility beneath. The noble feast has dazzled you, yes. But you carry with you the quiet knowledge that not all luxury is a blessing, and that sometimes, the richest tables bear the heaviest burdens. You find yourself walking slowly along a worn path that winds through centuries of history. This path leads to understanding, but also to questions that linger like the taste of old spices on your tongue. The medieval table you've just left behind was more than just a place of food. It was a crossroads of culture, survival, status, and tradition. Now, standing here, you begin to trace the legacy of those meals, their shadows stretching long into the kitchens and plates of later centuries, all the way up to the modern world you live in. The first thing you notice is how much the echoes of medieval eating habits still resonate. Take, for example, the obsession with spices. Today, you might sprinkle cinnamon on your morning coffee or add pepper to a salad without thinking twice. But those fragrant, expensive seasonings were once symbols of wealth, power, and even magic. They were traded along perilous routes that crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, coveted by kings and commoners alike. The legacy of spice trade shaped economies, inspired voyages of discovery, and even sparked wars. You imagine yourself in a bustling port city, a medieval market alive with the sounds of merchants hawking goods and sailors shouting over the clatter of cargo. In one stall, sacks of peppercorns spill like black jewels. In another, cinnamon sticks and cloves are piled high, their scents weaving a dizzying perfume through the air. The merchants, well aware of the status their wares confer, mark up prices to staggering heights. To possess these spices is to possess a piece of the world's mystery and wealth. Yet beneath the glamour there was a more troubling side. Those same spices were often used not just to flavor but to hide. They masked the taste of meats that had been hung too long, or fish that had begun to turn. This isn't just culinary creativity, it's a survival tactic born of limited preservation technology. Even now, historians debate how much of the medieval diet relied on genuinely fresh food versus food saved by spice and sauce. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but it's a reminder that luxury and necessity often dance a complicated tango. Then there's the humble bread, the bread of the poor and the bread of the rich, symbols not only of status but of changing agricultural and milling technology. The medieval obsession with white bread, made from refined flour, wasn't just about taste. It reflected social hierarchy. Whiter bread was purer, a mark of nobility, while darker, coarser bread was linked to poverty. You can still see remnants of that divide in our language in phrases like half-baked or breadwinner. But nutrition science tells a different story. The coarse whole-grain breads that medieval peasants relied on were richer in fiber, vitamins, and minerals than the noble loaves, and probably healthier in the long run. You step into a quieter space, picturing the simple pottages and stews bubbling over hearth fires in rural cottages. These dishes, made from whatever was at hand, root vegetables, herbs, scraps of meat or fish, were the backbone of medieval survival. They speak to human resilience and resourcefulness, the power to turn scarcity into sustenance. And yet, they also remind you of the hardships, the malnutrition, and the precariousness of life for most people. It's a humbling thought that for much of history, food was a gamble against hunger. You think about the social rituals surrounding food. Medieval feasts weren't just about eating, they were performances of power and place. The elaborate dishes, the procession of courses, the grotesque shows like live birds bursting from pies, all were ways to display status and reinforce social order. Today, banquets and formal dinners have softened, but the impulse remains. Think of the carefully curated dinner parties, the Instagram posts of gourmet meals, the cultural weight we give to where and what we eat. In many ways, the medieval banquet lives on in our own ways of dining and socializing. But the medieval diet also teaches a cautionary tale. The nobles' heavy reliance on rich meats, sugars, and exotic spices came with health consequences. Gout, tooth decay, and digestive problems were common among the upper classes. Even now, modern diets echo some of these pitfalls: too much processed sugar, too little fiber, excessive fat. There's a strange irony here, that centuries before nutrition science, medieval people grappled with these issues in their own way, even if the medical theories of humors and balance sound foreign to us now. Speaking of humors, you recall the medieval worldview that food affected the body's balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. This framework shaped everything from menu choices to medical treatments. Today we might chuckle at such ideas, but they represent an early attempt to understand the complex relationship between diet and health. Modern nutrition is still catching up in many ways, debating the effects of fats, sugars, and gut bacteria, and rediscovering the importance of holistic balance. You find yourself at a crossroads in history, between the old world's understanding and the new world's science. And here you see another legacy, the merging of food and medicine. Medieval cookery books often doubled as medical guides, prescribing dishes for ailments and dietary regimens for different temperaments. Some remedies sound strange, like using roasted sparrow tongues to ease headaches, yet others hint at an intuitive wisdom about herbs and digestion. Even today, some of those herbs, like fennel or mint, remain staples in herbal medicine. You pause and consider the social inequality baked into medieval food culture. While nobles dined in excess, the poor struggled to survive. This gap left a mark on culinary history, but it also led to innovation. Peasant dishes often used wild plants, foraged greens, and fermented foods that nobles might scorn. Some of these traditions endured and eventually made their way into broader cuisine. Fermentation, for instance, was a way to preserve nutrients and create flavor, a practice revived today in the surge of interest around kimchi, sauerkraut, and kombucha. As you walk through this historical landscape, you wonder what lessons we might take from these medieval tables. One is the importance of balance, between indulgence and restraint, between freshness and preservation, between community sharing and individual excess. The medieval diet was not a monolith but a spectrum, shifting with seasons, social class, and geography. It reminds you that food is not just calories but culture, identity, and even politics. Of course, some medieval habits have rightly faded. The reliance on animal fats and sugars, the distrust of fresh vegetables among the elite, the use of spices as masks rather than flavor enhancers, these are cautionary tales. Yet, you can't help but feel a kind of respect for the persistence of tradition, the slow evolution of culinary practice over centuries. The past is not so far away, it lingers in our recipes, our rituals, and even our cravings. As you near the end of your journey, you feel a gentle quiet settle over you. The bustling kitchens and grand halls grow distant, replaced by the soft flicker of candlelight and the warmth of a simple hearth. The story of medieval food is not just about hardship or excess but about human creativity in the face of limits. It is about the stories we tell ourselves around the table, the ties that bind family and community, and the ever-changing dance between nature and nurture. You breathe deeply, imagining the crackle of firewood, the murmur of voices settling into calm, the slow closing of eyes after a long day. This is the legacy of medieval food, not just in history books, but in the quiet moments when we nourish ourselves and those we love. And now, as the night grows deeper and your thoughts drift softly, you feel yourself ready to rest. The past has whispered its secrets, and you carry them with you, tucked safely into the folds of memory and dreams. You're still here, though the bustling medieval market stalls and echoing banquet halls have faded into a kind of distant twilight. It's quieter now. The air feels warmer, softer, as though the centuries have finally exhaled and let you rest. You are no longer surrounded by the clink of goblets or the murmurs of servants. Instead, there is only the faint hum of your own breathing, the quiet rhythm of the present moment. It's the space where stories settle, where their flavors linger like the aftertaste of something both familiar and strange. We've walked through so many kitchens together, some grand enough to hold 100 cooks, others so small that the fire itself seemed to take up half the room. We've tasted the sharp bite of spice and the comfort of slow-cooked stews. We've peeked at loaves of bread that told the story of class, and watched wine and ale stand in for safe drinking water. We've sat at long trestle tables under candlelight and at humble benches by the hearth. Each place, each dish, each moment has been a step into another time, and yet, somehow you carried a part of it away with you, like crumbs gathered in your pocket after a meal. As the memories line up in your mind, you notice how they weave together, not just as a record of what people ate, but as a reflection of what they valued, feared, and dreamed. Food was never just food. It was security in the middle of uncertainty, a show of wealth in the middle of competition, a comfort in the middle of hardship. It was how communities connected, how power announced itself, how love quietly expressed itself in the effort of preparation. And somewhere in those centuries, in the quiet corners of history, there's the truth that people, just like you, leaned toward the familiar taste that made them feel safe. Perhaps it was a particular soup, made with the same herbs every winter. Perhaps it was bread from the same mill, carrying the scent of home. These details are so small that they never make it into grand chronicles, yet they are what make life feel whole. If you close your eyes now, you might still picture the flicker of the fire against stone walls. You might hear the slow crackle of wood, the creak of a wooden spoon against the inside of a pot, the way voices drop when the night draws in. There's no rush in these sounds, only the long, patient rhythm of living, the way seasons once shaped the table far more than markets or machines. And you might notice that, for all the centuries that have passed, some part of that rhythm still hums quietly in you. Perhaps the lesson hiding in these stories is that simplicity often survives better than extravagance. The most lavish dishes of the nobility, the towers of sugared pastry, the meats drenched in imported spice, are now museum curiosities or footnotes in old cookbooks. But the humble pottage, the bread, the foraged greens, the quiet practice of fermenting or drying, those are still here, still nourishing bodies and families. It's as if history itself knows what is worth keeping, what deserves to be passed gently from hand to hand. And there's another lesson too, softer, more personal, that eating is never only about the food. It's about where you are, who you're with, and the unspoken ritual of sharing. In the Middle Ages, that might have meant passing a trencher of bread to the person beside you, or dipping into the same bowl of stew. Today it might mean setting the table for a friend or cooking a familiar dish for someone you love. The tools and taste change, but the heart of it doesn't. You've listened long enough to feel the weight of those centuries, but also their gentleness. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, of turning the hard bread of yesterday into something almost tender in memory. Even the strangest customs, the most impractical rules, now feel more like stories than like burdens. They are part of a tapestry that, seen from far away, is warmer and more beautiful than any single thread could be. And as you sit here, the last threads of that tapestry fading into the quiet of the present, you realize that the story isn't really ending. Every meal you eat tomorrow, every choice you make about what to put on your plate, will carry some echo of all the meals that came before. It may be faint, but it's there, history whispering in the sizzle of a pan, in the scent of herbs crushed between your fingers, in the way you pause before the first bite. Now the night has grown deep. The lights are low. Your breathing has slowed to match the quiet rhythm around you. You feel as though you've been walking for hours and finally you've come to the edge of a meadow under a pale moon. The air is still, the grass soft, the ground beneath you steady. You could stay here for a while, there's no reason to hurry anywhere else. Let the stories rest now. Let the voices of merchants, cooks, and lords dissolve into the silence. Let the scent of spice and bread fade into something lighter than air. You don't need to hold on to the details, they'll be here if you ever wish to return. For now, you can simply let yourself drift, the way a leaf rides the surface of a slow, dark river. Somewhere just past the edge of waking, the tables are still set, the fire still burning low, the doors still open to welcome you. But you don't have to walk back to them tonight. Tonight you can rest. And as the last of the candlelight dims, you hear a voice, soft, almost a whisper, saying the simplest, oldest truth there is. You have enough. You are enough. It is time to sleep. Good night.